What happens when thousands of heavily armed paratroopers suddenly descend from the night sky, landing deep behind enemy lines where no soldier expects them? And what do you do when the silence of midnight is shattered by the snap of parachutes and the crash of equipment, while German soldiers scramble awake in terror, unsure whether this is the beginning of an invasion or their final hour? The night of June 6, 1944 Dedo was not just a beach landing, it began in the skies. American paratroopers of the 82nd and 101st Airborne Divisions were dropped into the darkness of occupied France. Their mission: secure bridges, cut off reinforcements, and plunge chaos into the German rear. They were outnumbered, scattered, and often lost in the fog of war, but their sudden arrival stunned German forces who believed their flanks were safe. What followed was confusion, brutal fights, and acts of extraordinary courage. This is the untold story of the night the Germans were caught completely off guard. A story of young men who leaped into the unknown, knowing they might not live to see the sunrise. Stay with this film, and you'll step into their boots, hear their fears, feel the shock of battle, and witness how a handful of paratroopers turned the tide of history. Now let's begin. What kind of man leaps into the darkness of enemy territory, not knowing if he will land in a field, a swamp, or the middle of a German machine gun nest? And what possessed these young paratroopers to jump from the safety of their aircraft, plunging into a world where every shadow could conceal death? The night was heavy, the kind of darkness that presses against your skin. Above the French countryside, the drone of hundreds of C-47 transport planes filled the sky. Inside each fuselage sat men of the 82nd and 101st Airborne Divisions, rifles cradled in their laps, hearts hammering beneath their gear. They were barely more than boys 19-20-21, but they were about to be asked to do the impossible. The green lights on the jump doors would flicker, the orders would be shouted, and they would step into the void. The Germans believed their rear lines were secure. Their attention was fixed on the Atlantic Wall and the beaches where they expected an invasion. The idea that elite American paratroopers might suddenly fall behind their defenses was something most German commanders dismissed as fantasy. Yet, on that fateful night, fantasy became reality. Inside the transports, the men wrestled with their own fears. Sergeant Bill Miller of the 101st whispered a prayer, gripping the handle of his parachute cord so tightly his knuckles went white. Next to him, Private John Dawson tried to crack a joke about the French wine he hoped to drink when all this was over. But his laugh died quickly in his throat. The roar of the engines, the smell of oil and sweat, the vibration of the fuselage, everything seemed to magnify the truth. They were about to leap into the unknown. When the anti-aircraft fire began, chaos erupted. German flak batteries had spotted the incoming planes, and brilliant streaks of tracer rounds lit up the night. Explosions blossomed in the sky as shells tore through the air, shaking the transports violently. Some planes caught fire. Others veered off course. Pilots shouted over radios, struggling to maintain formation. For the men in the back, every burst of light outside the windows was a reminder of how close death hovered. Stand up. The jumpmaster's command was sharp, and the paratroopers rose, their equipment clattering. Each man tethered to the static line above. Hook up. The sound of metallic clicks filled the cabin as parachute cords snapped into place. Red light glowed near the door, bathing the men in a blood-colored hue. Their eyes locked onto it, waiting for the moment it would change. As the first men shuffled toward the open door, they could see the chaos below. Burning wreckage on the ground, German searchlights stabbing upward, tracer rounds clawing at the night sky. A paratrooper muttered under his breath, "This is suicide." Yet when the light turned green, one by one, they hurled themselves into the void. The first seconds after the leap were sheer disorientation. The rush of wind ripped at their faces, the blackness below swallowing them whole. Then, with a violent tug, parachutes snapped open, jerking their bodies upward. The silence was eerie. For a brief moment, the noise of the planes and the flak guns was gone. All they could hear was the creak of their harnesses and the beating of their own hearts. But below them, the night was alive with danger. Many were scattered miles off course. Some landed in flooded marshes, struggling against the weight of their gear as cold water dragged them under. Others crashed into hedgerows or found themselves hanging helplessly from trees, their legs dangling above German patrols who prowled the countryside. The lucky ones touched down in open fields, only to discover they were not alone. German soldiers were already moving to intercept. For the German defenders, the shock was overwhelming. Villagers later recalled the sight of parachutes blossoming across the sky like ghostly flowers. Soldiers stumbled from their barracks, shouting in confusion. Commanders scrambled to make sense of what was happening. Was this a diversion? Was the main invasion here? Reports flooded into headquarters, but none made sense. One officer muttered, "The Americans are everywhere, but we cannot see them." On the ground, small groups of paratroopers tried to rally. In Sainte-Mère-Église, a village destined to become immortalized in history, one young paratrooper found himself caught on the church steeple, his parachute lines tangled in stone. German troops spotted him, bullets whizzing past his dangling body. He could do nothing but hang there, feigning death as the firefight raged below. Meanwhile, scattered units attempted to carry out their mission. They had to seize crossroads, capture bridges, and block German reinforcements from reaching the beaches. But with men landing miles apart, leaders had to improvise. Lieutenant Richard Winters of Easy Company quickly gathered a handful of men, far fewer than he was supposed to. Commandant led them toward a German artillery position, outnumbered, under-equipped, but determined. He launched a daring assault that would silence the guns threatening the beaches. Everywhere, stories of courage and desperation unfolded. A lone paratrooper crouched in a hedgerow, listening to German boots crunch past just yards away, his finger trembling on the trigger of his rifle. Another group, cut off and lost, stumbled into a farmhouse, where French resistance fighters whispered urgently, pointing them toward enemy positions. These moments of human connection between soldiers and civilians wove together the fragile threads of survival. By dawn, the countryside of Normandy was a patchwork of chaos. German commanders reported paratroopers in every direction, their movements unpredictable and terrifying. In reality, the Americans were disorganized and scattered, but the effect was the same. Confusion spread like wildfire through the German ranks. Reinforcements meant for the beaches were delayed, diverted, or destroyed by small bands of airborne soldiers who fought with ferocity far beyond their numbers. Imagine being one of those paratroopers, crouching in the damp grass, hearing the distant rumble of German tanks and knowing your rifle might be the only thing standing between success and disaster. You had no idea where the rest of your unit was. You didn't even know if the invasion on the beaches had begun. All you knew was that you were behind enemy lines, hunted, and very much alive for now. The Germans, stunned by this unexpected strike, scrambled to regain control. But the seed of panic had been planted. Reports came in of bridges blown up, communications cut, and supply lines severed. Each act of sabotage by a handful of paratroopers amplified the illusion of a massive force lurking in the countryside. And when daylight finally revealed the parachutes littering the fields, the Germans understood the truth. The Americans were everywhere, and they had arrived in the dead of night. The question now was simple: could these scattered, exhausted paratroopers hold long enough to make DA succeed? Or would the Germans regroup and crush them before the beach landings could secure a foothold? What do you do when you land in the wrong place, cut off from your brothers, surrounded by an enemy that knows every road, every hedge, every farmhouse? How do you survive when the darkness fades and you realize you are deep in enemy territory, hunted like prey, with the fate of the entire invasion resting on your shoulders? As dawn broke over Normandy on June 6, 1944, the scattered American paratroopers emerged from the shadows. Some were wet and shivering, having dragged themselves from flooded fields where entire sticks of men had drowned beneath the weight of their gear. Others were still lost in thick hedgerows, unable to find their bearings. A few clutched only pistols, their rifles lost during the violent parachute drop. Yet each man carried something far heavier than equipment: the knowledge that they were alone, and that every minute counted. In villages like Sainte-Mère-Église, German garrisons were already stirring. The town had strategic importance at crossroads that controlled vital routes leading to the beaches. If the Germans held it, reinforcements could roll quickly to the coast and smash the Allied landings. If the Americans captured it, the German lines would be fractured. The paratroopers knew this, even when they landed far from their intended zones. For them, survival was not simply about making it through the day, it was about altering the entire course of the war. Private Charles Chuck Bradford, barely 20 years old, found himself alone after landing in a head. His parachute was tangled in branches, and it had taken him nearly 20 minutes to cut himself free. The night was alive, with distant gunfire and shouts in German. Crawling through mud, he stumbled upon two other soldiers, both from different companies. None of them knew exactly where they were. Chuck whispered, "We stick together. No matter what." That pact, made in a whisper, was one echoed across Normandy by countless men who became brothers not through training, but through desperation. The Germans were just as unsettled. In the early hours, reports flowed in from panicked outposts. Soldiers described paratroopers landing everywhere, even though in reality many zones had only a handful of Americans. The psychological impact was devastating. General Wilhelm Farley, commander of the 91st Infantry Division, was caught traveling in his car when paratroopers ambushed him. His death at their hands was more than a tactical loss, it was a symbol of German disarray. Command structures wavered. Orders contradicted each other. Confusion reigned. Meanwhile, small skirmishes ignited across the countryside. In one hedgerow, Lieutenant Richard Winters and a dozen men came face to face with a German artillery battery near Brickcourt Manor. The guns threatened Utah Beach, where thousands of Allied troops were about to storm ashore. Outnumbered, Winters orchestrated a textbook assault, moving his men through the hedgerows with precision. Grenades exploded, rifles cracked, and within an hour, the German guns were silenced. The attack became legendary not only for its success, but because it demonstrated how scattered, understrength groups of paratroopers could change the fate of the invasion. In St. Mareglis, chaos took on a surreal form. Around the town square, houses burned after a wayward flare ignited rooftops. Civilians rushed with buckets, trying to douse the flames, while German soldiers barked orders in confusion. Into this inferno drifted dozens of parachutes. Some men landed directly in the town, bullets cutting through the air as Germans fired upward. One unlucky paratrooper, John Steele, found himself caught on the church steeple. Dangling helplessly above the square, he pretended to be dead as Germans and villagers alike watched the battle unfold beneath his swaying body. By morning, Saint-Mère-Église was in American hands, the first town in France to be liberated. But liberation came at a cost. The Germans counterattacked with ferocity, sending armored units and infantry columns to retake the crossroads. The paratroopers, many fighting with whatever weapons they could scavenge, dug into gardens, ditches, and barns. Every street corner became a fortress. Every wall a shield. Civilians huddled in basements, praying the bullets would not find them. The fighting was intimate and brutal. Face to face, house-to-house. Imagine being there. The smell of smoke clogging your lungs. The sound of boots pounding against cobblestones. The sudden burst of a grenade exploding against the stone wall. You can feel the fear and adrenaline pumping through your veins as you crouch behind a wagon, your rifle trembling in your hands. The Germans are shouting in a language you barely understand, but their intent is clear. They want this town back, and they will kill anyone who stands in their way. Elsewhere, paratroopers faced even harsher realities. Many were completely isolated, fighting as tiny pockets of resistance. A group of 5 men ambushed a German convoy, using the cover of hedgerows to launch a sudden attack. They destroyed 2 trucks and vanished before the enemy could retaliate. Another group blew up a bridge, cutting off a crucial route to the beaches. These small, scattered victories created the illusion of an overwhelming American presence. To the Germans, it seemed as if an entire army had fallen from the sky. Yet for every act of heroism, there was tragedy. In a flooded field, dozens of paratroopers drowned before they could even unclip their harnesses. Others were captured shortly after landing, executed by German patrols who saw them not as soldiers but as saboteurs. Still others were simply lost, wandering for hours before stumbling into friendly lines or enemy ambushes. The human cost was immense, but the chaos they caused was priceless. The Germans, stunned by the boldness of these young Americans, struggled to organize. Communications were cut, bridges destroyed, roads blocked. The paratroopers had achieved what their commanders had hoped for: confusion. German reinforcements that might have reached Omaha and Utah beaches were instead locked in firefights with small, determined bands of airborne soldiers. Each delay bought time for the men storming the beaches, who faced their own nightmare against machine guns and artillery. By the afternoon of June 6th, the countryside was alive with constant fighting. Paratroopers who had been strangers hours before now trusted each other with their lives. They formed makeshift units, often under the command of whoever showed the most courage. Sometimes a sergeant commanded a dozen men, sometimes a private did. Ranks blurred in the smoke and blood. What mattered was survival and the mission. One paratrooper later recalled, "It didn't matter if you were lost. As long as you were shooting Germans and blowing bridges, you were in the right place." That became the unspoken creed of the airborne that day. As evening approached, the Germans launched larger counterattacks. Armored columns rolled forward, their tanks crushing fences and hedgerows. The paratroopers had little to counter with only bazookas, mines, and sheer determination. Ambushes became their weapon of choice. In one instance, a handful of men waited in silence as a German tank rumbled past. At the perfect moment, they struck, crippling the beast with a well-placed shot. The explosion shook the earth, and the paratroopers vanished before reinforcements could arrive. Still, exhaustion was setting in. Many had not slept in over 24 hours. Food was scarce, water scarcer, ammunition was precious. Yet they pushed forward, driven by something greater than themselves. They knew that if they failed, the men storming the beaches would pay the price. Every field held meaning. Every skirmish mattered. By the end of D-Day, thousands of paratroopers were still scattered across Normandy, many far from their intended objectives, but they had succeeded in their ultimate purpose: stunning the Germans, sowing chaos, and buying the time needed for the greatest amphibious landing in history to gain a foothold. The question now lingered in every heart. American and German alike, could the scattered, bloodied paratroopers hold the ground they had won? Or would the enemy rally under the cover of night and push them back into the sea? What happens when the enemy you have stunned begins to recover, regroup, and strike back with everything it has? And how do a scattered handful of paratroopers, hungry, exhausted, and cut off from their main force, stand against the full fury of German armor and infantry determined to drive them into the sea? The first day had been chaos, confusion, and scattered skirmishes. But as the sun set on June 6, 1944, the Germans realized the scale of what had just happened. Paratroopers had not landed by accident. They had not been scattered for nothing. These Americans had seized key bridges, cut supply lines, and infiltrated deep behind the front. Now the Germans, their pride wounded and their command paralyzed by contradictory orders, prepared to strike back. The bocage countryside of Normandy was a natural fortress. Ancient hedgerows lined every field. Thick walls of earth and tangled vegetation that turned each patch of land into a miniature battlefield. For the paratroopers, this terrain offered cover and concealment. For the Germans, it offered opportunities for ambush and encirclement. In Saint-Mir, where the stars and stripes had been raised over the town square, the paratroopers knew the Germans would not let their first liberated village stand unchallenged. And indeed, as night fell, the rumble of tanks and the tramp of infantry echoed in the distance. German reinforcements, many from the feared 91st Infantry Division and the 6th Fallschirmjäger Regiment, were moving in to retake what had been lost. Lieutenant Colonel Edward Krauss of the 505th Parachute Infantry Regiment rallied his men. Ammunition was low. Many had landed without heavy weapons. But they dug in around the town, turning every window, every doorway, every garden wall into a defensive position. "Hold at all costs," he ordered, his voice steady, even as he knew how thin their line was. The first German assaults came in waves. Infantry, advancing cautiously through the fields, supported by sporadic mortar fire. The paratroopers, hidden in hedgerows and barns, opened fire at close range. Rifles cracked, machine guns chattered, grenades arced into the night. The Germans fell back, regrouped, and pressed again. Each time they came, the Americans met them with stubborn resistance. Elsewhere in the countryside, isolated groups of paratroopers faced their own nightmares. A squad of the 101st Airborne stumbled into a German patrol in the dark. The firefight that followed was savage and brief, men wrestling in the mud, bayonets flashing, pistols roaring at point-blank range. When it ended, only a handful of Americans remained standing. They buried their comrades in a shallow ditch, whispered a prayer, and moved on. For the Germans, the shock of the airborne assault was wearing off. Reports from the beaches made it clear. The landings were real, and the paratroopers were not a diversion. Panic gave way to determination. Orders were barked across the countryside. Retake the bridges, clear the roads, crush the Americans. Panzer units began to roll. The paratroopers had little to match German armor. A Sherman tank could outgun a Panther or Tiger only under the right conditions. And most airborne soldiers had no Shermans at all, only bazookas, mines, and guts. Sergeant James Jim Kelly and his squad lay in wait along a narrow lane, listening to the grinding approach of a German half. When it appeared, silhouetted against the faint glow of a burning farmhouse, Kelly shouted, "Now!" A bazooka fired, striking the vehicle and erupting in flame. Germans leaped from the wreck, only to be cut down by rifle fire. For a moment, victory tasted sweet, but in the distance, more engines rumbled. Kelly knew this was only the beginning. Inside German command posts, tempers flared. Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, though away from Normandy that day, had long warned that an invasion was inevitable. His subordinates debated whether to throw armored reserves against the beaches or crush the paratroopers first. The indecision proved costly. Hours passed. Orders conflicted, and all the while, the paratroopers dug deeper. Holding ground they had no business holding. In the hedgerows, fear and exhaustion gnawed at every man. Imagine crouching in the damp earth, your stomach empty, your throat parched, your rifle slick with sweat. The night is alive with whispers, German voices moving in the dark, the metallic clank of weapons being readied. Every rustle of leaves could be death creeping closer. Yet you cannot move, cannot sleep. You wait, heart pounding, finger resting on the trigger, praying that dawn will come before they find you. As June 7th dawned, the Germans launched a massive counterattack towards Saint-Mere. Infantry surged through the fields, supported by armor and artillery. The town shook under the bombardment. Buildings collapsed, fires raged, civilians screamed in basements. The paratroopers dug in behind rubble and hedgerows, fired until their rifles overheated. Bazooka teams darted between cover, taking suicidal shots at advancing tanks. One paratrooper later recalled, "We weren't soldiers that day. We were cornered animals, fighting with everything we had because there was no other choice, and yet, against all odds, the Americans held." Reinforcements from Utah Beach, 4th Infantry Division troops, pushing inland, finally linked with the battered airborne units. The relief was overwhelming. Men who had fought for 36 hours without rest wept openly at the sight of fresh troops. The line had held, the town remained free, and the Germans had been denied their prize. Still, the battle was far from over. Across Normandy, German counterattacks continued. The bocage became a labyrinth of death. Every field was contested, every hedgerow fought for, as if it were a fortress. Paratroopers lived like shadows, striking suddenly, vanishing into the earth, ambushing convoys, blowing bridges, and sowing terror wherever they went. The Germans, who had once been the hunters, now found themselves stalked. Patrols moved cautiously, fearing an ambush at every turn. Officers barked orders nervously, scanning tree lines for the glint of an American helmet. Morale faltered. Rumors spread of ghost soldiers who seemed to appear and vanish without warning. For the paratroopers, the cost was immense. Hundreds lay dead in fields and ditches, their sacrifice unrecorded except by the comrades who carried their memory. Yet their mission had succeeded beyond expectation. They had stunned the Germans, delayed reinforcements, and given the Allies the foothold they needed on the beaches, the question now loomed larger than ever. Could these battered men, their numbers dwindling, sustain the momentum? Or would the German counterattacks, growing heavier by the hour, finally break them and hurl the Allies back into the sea? What do you do when every field becomes a trap, every hedgerow a fortress, and every step forward feels like walking into an ambush? How do men survive when the land itself conspires with the enemy, turning Normandy into a vast killing ground where no place is safe and no path is clear? By the second week of June 1944, the paratroopers of the 82nd and 101st Airborne were no longer strangers to chaos. They had survived the drop, the scattered landings, and the first brutal counterattacks. Now, they faced a new enemy, just as dangerous as the German army. The terrain of Normandy itself. The bocage was unlike anything the Americans had trained for. Ancient hedgerows, some taller than a man on horseback, walled off every field. Thick with roots, vines, and centuries of growth, they formed natural fortifications that turned the countryside into a deadly maze. Every advance meant climbing or blasting through these barriers, never knowing what waited on the other side. Sometimes it was empty farmland. Other times it was a machine gun nest or an entire platoon of German infantry waiting with rifles. The Germans knew this land intimately. They had patrolled it, mapped it, and prepared it. For them, the hedgerows were Allies concealing their movements, shielding their defenses, and funneling the Americans into narrow killing zones. For the paratroopers, it was like fighting blindfolded, always guessing, always fearing. Private Jack Daniels of the 101st recalled his first hedgerow fight. His squad crawled on their bellies, pressed flat against the earth as German MG-42 fire shredded the leaves above them. You couldn't see the enemy, he said later. You only saw the flashes of their guns, and you prayed you'd live long enough to reach the next field. Small units moved cautiously, bayonets fixed, rifles ready, hearts pounding. The order often came in whispers. On 3, we go. Men would scramble up the earthen bank, throw grenades over the wall, and then leap blindly into the smoke. Sometimes they found Germans fleeing. Other times they landed in the middle of a firefight, so sudden and violent it seemed the world itself had exploded. For days, the fighting was relentless. Sleep came in stolen minutes, food in small bites from ration tins. Water was drawn from wells, often under fire. The paratroopers grew hollow-eyed, their uniforms caked in mud, their boots worn raw, but they pressed on, because behind them lay the beaches. And beyond them, the fate of Europe. The Germans struck with precision. Mortar teams lobbed shells over the hedgerows, turning fields into slaughterhouses. Snipers perched in trees or hidden windows picked off officers and radiomen. Knowing that without leaders and communication, the Americans would falter, armored units prowled the lanes, their tanks moving like predators, their guns sweeping the fields. Against such odds, the paratroopers adapted. Bazooka teams became hunters, stalking tanks from behind hedgerows, waiting until the steel beasts rumbled close enough to strike. Riflemen crawled forward under fire, inch by inch, as machine gunners laid down suppressive bursts. Engineers blew gaps in the hedgerows with explosives, allowing squads to pour through and overwhelm the enemy in vicious close-quarters combat. One such battle unfolded near the village of Carrington, a key objective linking Utah and Omaha beaches. Without Carrington, the Allied invasion would remain split, vulnerable to German counterattack. The paratroopers were tasked with taking it, though it was heavily defended. On June 12, the 101st launched their assault. The approach was nightmarish, hedgerow after hedgerow filled with German defenders, artillery pounding the fields, smoke rising in dark columns against the sky. Paratroopers advanced yard by yard, men falling beside them, the survivors pressing forward with grim determination. By the time they reached the outskirts of Carrington, they were exhausted, bloodied, and running low on ammunition. Inside the town, street fighting erupted. Houses became fortresses, windows sniping positions, alleyways, Germans fired from rooftops and cellars, forcing the Americans to clear each building room by room. Grenades rolled down staircases, rifles cracked in narrow corridors, and the screams of the wounded echoed through the stone walls. For the civilians trapped in Carrington, it was a nightmare. Families huddled in basements as walls shook and glass shattered. Children cried quietly in the dark while their parents prayed for the thunder to stop. When the Americans broke through, many civilians emerged dazed, clinging to the soldiers as if they were angels sent from heaven. But the battle was not over. At dawn on June 13th, the Germans counterattacked with the full might of the 17th SS Panzergrenadier Division. Armored vehicles rolled forward, supported by waves of infantry. The paratroopers, weary and low on supplies, braced for annihilation. Sergeant Don Malarkey later recalled, "It was like the earth itself was moving toward us, the ground shaking with every tank that came closer, pinned down." Bleeding and desperate, the paratroopers fought with ferocity born of survival. Bazooka rounds streaked toward tanks, machine guns rattled from second-story windows, mortar thumped from makeshift positions. For hours, the town teetered on the edge of collapse. Then, just as the Germans threatened to break through, reinforcements from the 2nd Armored Division thundered into battle. American tanks clashed with German armor in the streets, the clash of steel echoing through Carentan. By nightfall, the Germans retreated. Carrington belonged to the Americans. The link between Utah and Omaha beaches was secured. The cost, however, was staggering. Streets were littered with wreckage and bodies. Survivors sat in silence, staring at nothing. Too numb even to eat. Imagine being one of those slumped against a ruined wall, your rifle across your knees. Your uniform stiff with blood and sweat. You survived, but at what price? Your friends lay buried in shallow graves outside town. The enemy was still out there, regrouping, and the war was far from over. The hedgerow battles would drag on, day after day, week after week. Each field, each village, each road claimed in blood. Yet through it all, the paratroopers endured. They adapted, they fought, and they proved that even in the most impossible conditions, courage could carve a path forward. The Germans had been stunned by the initial airborne assault, but now they fought back with the fury of a cornered animal. The question was no longer whether the paratroopers could survive the night. It was whether they could endure the grind of a war where every step forward demanded sacrifice, and where every sunrise brought the promise of another deadly fight. And in the shadow of the hedgerows, as the bodies mounted and the villages burned, another truth began to dawn. This was not simply the liberation of Normandy. This was the beginning of the end for Nazi Germany. But the road to that end would be paved in blood, sweat, and the lives of men who had jumped into the night, never knowing if they would live to see another dawn. What happens when exhausted men, bloodied by days of fighting, must summon one final reserve of strength to hold their ground against a relentless enemy? How do you endure when your body wants to collapse, your mind screams for rest? And yet history demands that you stand firm because the fate of thousands and the success of the greatest invasion in history rests upon your shoulders. By late June 1944, the American paratroopers of the 82nd and 101st Airborne had fought for nearly 3 weeks in the hedgerows of Normandy. They had dropped into the night like ghosts, survived isolation and chaos, battled in Saint-Mere, Eglis, endured Carrington, and held the line against wave after wave of German counterattacks. Their mission had been to disrupt, delay, and weaken the enemy long enough for the beach landings to succeed. They had done far more. They had shattered the Germans' sense of security, cut vital routes, and proven that lightly armed airborne infantry could outfight even the might of panzer divisions when necessity demanded it. But the Germans were not yet beaten. Field Marshal Rommel poured reinforcements into Normandy, determined to push the Allies back into the sea before their bridgeheads could expand. Paratroopers found themselves pressed to their limits, scattered across fields and villages, dug into hedgerows, and constantly harassed by artillery, mortar, and sniper fire. Supplies were short. Water came from farm wells. Ammunition was rationed with care. Yet they endured, because retreat was impossible. In the countryside around Carrington, the fighting became personal, brutal, and unrelenting. German counterattacks came at dawn, the rumble of tanks shaking the ground. the shouts of infantry echoing through the hedgerows. Each assault tested the Americans' resolve. Each defense left more men wounded or dead. And yet, each time, the paratroopers held. They fired until their weapons overheated, ambushed tanks with and countercharged with bayonets when overrun. Lieutenant Colonel Robert Cole of the 502nd Parachute Infantry Regiment led one of the most desperate actions of the campaign, what became known as Cole's Charge. His battalion, pinned down by relentless German fire near Carrington, could not advance. Cole ordered a bayonet charge across open ground, directly into machine gun nests. Screaming at the top of their lungs, paratroopers surged forward through a storm of bullets, hurling grenades and stabbing with steel until the enemy line broke. The cost was terrible, but the victory decisive. That charge broke the German defense and secured Carrington once and for all. Cole himself was later awarded the Medal of Honor, though he would not live to wear it, falling in Holland later that year. As days turned into weeks, the paratroopers' bond grew deeper than blood. Men who had landed miles apart on DID now fought shoulder to shoulder as if they had known each other all their lives. They shared cigarettes in the mud, whispered jokes in the lulls, and wept quietly when comrades fell. To civilians, they were liberators' angels in dirty uniforms, handing out chocolate and chewing gum to children even as artillery shells burst nearby. To the Germans, they were a nightmare that would not fade, a phantom force that appeared suddenly, struck savagely, and vanished again into the HEDGEROWS. By the end of June, the Allies had broken out from the beaches, linking the American, British, and Canadian forces into a solid front. The Germans, reeling from losses, began to retreat inland. For the paratroopers, this meant at last a moment to breathe, to bury their dead, to tend their wounds, and to reflect on what they had endured. They had landed scattered and lost, but their stubborn courage had stunned the enemy and bought the precious time needed for the Normandy landings to succeed. Imagine standing in a Normandy field in late June. The morning mist clings to the grass. Around you lie dozens of parachutes, now abandoned, white silk shrouds draped across hedges. Silent witnesses to the night of the drop. Rifles lean against walls, helmets lie dented in the mud. Somewhere in the distance, church bells ring in a liberated village. You are alive, but forever changed. You have seen fear, courage, and sacrifice beyond measure. The Germans, who once laughed at the thought of American paratroopers landing in their rear, were not laughing anymore. They were stunned by the audacity, the resilience, and the unbreakable will of men who dropped into the darkness and refused to yield. The story of those paratroopers is not just one of tactics and battles. It is a story of human endurance, of ordinary young men thrust into extraordinary circumstances, who rose to the moment when history called. They did not know if they would survive. Many did not. But because of them, the beaches were held, the landings secured, and the path to victory in Europe opened. And so, as the smoke cleared and the paratroopers marched on muddy, weary, but unbroken, they carried with them the knowledge that they had been part of something larger than themselves. They had shocked the enemy, liberated the oppressed, and written a chapter of courage that would never be forgotten. The night the paratroopers landed behind enemy lines was the night the Germans were stunned, and the night the tide of history began to turn.